You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, well, hello everybody. I'm Eric Vansel,
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
and of course, we're your hosts for this show. And so tonight, we are going to attempt to do the insurmountable task of actually trying, and this is a viewer suggestion, by the way. I'm pretty sure that it was Ted Adam Green's suggestion, but he basically wrote in and said, hey, you know what would be a really good topic is if you guys would, figure out, like, okay, if you take the Mando-Verse and you take the sequel trilogy in particular, can you somehow unite this into one unified canon? And that actually got us thinking, what if we were to actually try to figure out beyond just the Mando-Verse and the sequel trilogy and try to include some of the comics, try to include some of the novels, of course, naturally the prequel and, original trilogy. What if we were to try to take all of that stuff and unify it into a canon? How would we do that? And, it's it's kind of, look, let's face it. Lucasfilm hasn't even successfully been able to do this. So obviously we want to hear from you guys tonight. We've already heard from Dragonfly Mask. He says, nice, you are having a good tonight. I guess he means good night tonight. Yeah. No, no migraines, no work schedules, no. I do actually have a bad headache today, though. This weather change that we're experiencing right now in Michigan, it's killing me. Look at this. Daryl's over there coughing. So it might be a bit premature to say we're having a good night tonight. Although, we have gotten a boatload of new subscribers. So I want to take this opportunity that if you're one of the hundreds of new subscribers that we have, welcome to the show. I hope you guys enjoy it and, find it worth continuing subscribing to us and perhaps even hitting that like button. Before we get into this, though, I got to tell you, I don't know if you got my text, but there is this new documentary that actually was released in theaters today. It's limited, and it's going around to different states or whatever, right? So, like, I think it was in LA yesterday, New York today, something like that. It's actually a documentary on the making of the holiday special, which, and it's a comedic thing though, in a way. But they interview people, like they interview some of the people involved. They interview like Weird Al Yankovic. They interview Seth Green. They interview like all these people who are either like fans or people who are actually involved in it somehow. But I thought that, given that the thing did come out like 45 years ago, around now, actually, it was actually released, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, which is another thing. Before we get into this thing tonight, we should plug our shows next week. We're not sure what's going to be on Monday yet, but it'll more than likely be pre-recorded. However, Wednesday is our annual Thanksgiving special, where we bring on our good friend and sometimes co-host Dave Cossey, and he will join us, and we're going to talk about our favorite Star Wars clips. We're going to pick a dramatic clip, a comedic clip, and an action-filled clip. Each one of us have done this already, and we're going to talk about it and comment on each other, so it should be a fun show. Usually, our Thanksgiving special show, which will be on Wednesday, 8 o'clock, yeah, it should be fun. So you guys are not going to want to miss that. But I don't know, getting into this whole uniting the canon thing. I guess first of all, I should probably start out by saying, do you think it's possible?
Maybe. I'm just really not a fan of actually uniting all the series. I think that we could. I think the Mando-Verse should kind of stand on its own. But what I would say um, a in the spirit of uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Not collaboration, but um, in the spirit of
It's
just
late.
trying.
I understand.
I know, yeah, it's late and
You know, it's
it's
that's
getting
one
off
of the
work. It's
downsides. Exactly, it's one of the downsides of doing the show later. You know, it's like on one hand, it's cool because everybody could just, you know, whatever you guys are doing on a Friday night, you know, you could just come in and relax or whatever. But you know, on the other hand, I mean, yeah, it's you know, it's been a long day or whatever for most people, and so I get it. You know, words might be one of those things you have to let go.
compromises. I needed a little break. Thank you, Eric.
Always happy to help you,
And
my friend. Always happy to help you.
in the spirit of compromise, there we go. In the spirit of compromise, I would say that the Mandoverse probably could set up the sequel trilogy, but I wouldn't try to, because a lot of people are thinking like, okay, use the Mandoverse to kind of overwrite the sequel trilogy
Well,
in
I
a
don't think
weird
that that's
way.
what we mean. I don't think that was what we mean.
Well, no, I'm
Actually,
just saying some people think that's what should be done. All I'm saying is, I just think as a compromise between all of it, I think it should just at least be able to kind of set up how we get to the sequel trilogy. And that way, and the sequel trilogy just has to stand on its own and it has to fix its own problems, quite frankly, because I don't think that the Mandoverse was originally designed to, I won't say it wasn't designed to fix the sequel trilogy, but when you're trying to connect things, you kind of have to start things. You have to plan it that way, and we all know Star Wars is is notorious for not planning crap, as we
yeah.
can see in the sequel trilogy, because none of the directors knew what each other were doing. So to try to actually go back and try to connect it, I think that's a bit of a tall order to no pun intended, to give or to make happen. I think we should just set it up the best way we can, and then let the sequel be what it is. It was a goof on Disney's part by not really thinking everything through. I think everybody's trying to marvelize everything in the sense of how the Marvel movie is kind of connected all the thing, but it was planned that way, and it was actually designed and executed to that way.
No, that's
This
true.
wasn't. And when you
So you're
have
saying
things
it
like,
would be irresponsible or maybe just a bad idea overall to
and even
try
it
to
could be more
do that, right?
detrimental now. Yeah,
Well,
because then now
yeah.
you're kind of screwing and ruining the Mandoverse because you're taking something that's good and you're trying to make it adapt to crap.
Well, but here's the thing that you got to look at too, and let me because you know uh, our originator for this topic, Ted Adam Green, he writes in. He says, "Hey guys, let's have a fun podcast. We always try to have a fun podcast." Another thought I've got is that Star Wars is already a multiverse. The original Lucas verse, then the EU Legends verse, and next the Disney verse. In other words, the sequels. There's a lot of verses, my friend. And then the Mando-Verse trying to blend them all together, sorta. So, kind of. And actually, Ted brings up a good point because this is where you get into somewhat dangerous territory, actually. And this was something that I think is somewhat of an unintended consequence of just real life events, right? Because obviously, Lucas, first of all, you have to remember that you can look at it that way, especially under Lucas, because he never considered the expanded universe canonical at all.
Right.
Like,
Right.
Period. It was kind of like, okay, I'm going to license because there's a hunger for this. And Lucas didn't want to sit there 24/7 churning out different stories. He's like, look, I'll license this out to writers, and because at the time it was basically mostly contained in books. But I'll license this out to writers. I'll do all that. But you have to understand that when I do that, if you guys want to say, hey, this is the official version in your own head, that's cool. But Lucas is like, reality-wise, the only thing that really counts is anything that I do. And that's the way it stood for a long time. Now, as time went on and the stories began to take form and the expanded universe basically became this monolithic empire, no pun intended, that nobody at Lucasfilm ever expected. Nobody thought the expanded universe was going to be as big as it was. And so that presented a problem. And so what ended up happening was now Lucas had a problem because all the fans were really into this, right? So what he started to do, particularly with the prequels, is he began to incorporate elements of the expanded universe. He actually canonized certain things. Now, some things like the origin of Boba Fett, the introduction of Jango Fett, all that stuff, that was stuff that actually directly contradicted the expanded universe. But there were other things, like when he brought in Quinlan Voss, and there were other little things that he put in there too. Coruscant. Actually, Coruscant that was a Timothy Zahn invention. That's what he called the core planet. By Lucas actually making that the capital core planet in the prequel trilogy, that was huge. Because that was Lucas's big, okay, I'm going to acknowledge some of the things about the expanded universe that I like that I can put into my vision and in a way honor the fans. But it wasn't originally intended that way. So then of course they sold it, right? And he sold it to Disney. And now Disney said, okay, look, you have Lucas's thing, you have this expanded universe, there's contradictions. Even within the expanded universe itself, you have just all these convoluted things. You have, books where other books have painted themselves into a corner. There was just, it was salvageable, but it got a little messy. Anybody that actually really followed the expanded universe knows that it did get a little messy at times. So what Disney did, and I actually thought this was a wise decision at the time. I was disappointed, but I understood in the spirit of it, and that was, look, we're just going to make everything canon. We're not going to have this isn't canon, this is. We're going to actually make everything canon and start from scratch. We're going to brand the expanded universe as legends, so they'll still exist, but it's almost like these like legendary stories or something. We're just going to do that. And then we're going to start anew. And actually, that would have been a good idea. Now, Dragonfly, he has a couple of things that we should bring in at this point of the discussion. Says, I always thought it was he transformed his hand into the gun from the Fifth Element decision. That 30-year time gap between 6 and 7. Yeah, not sure what you mean. But he does go on to say, I think he clarified, I always thought it was a conscious decision from Disney to do the 30-year time gap between 6 to 7 because they had plans to fill it in. That's true. That's basically, and this actually brings me nicely into answering your point. And that is that I know some fans have said, yes, they could actually, I've even said it myself actually, where if they wanted to, they could eventually softly reboot the sequels by just telling so many stories and going off on another direction that you could just go around if you have like, say, 20 years worth of stories that start with the Mando-Verse and continue on, you can slowly but surely shift the storyline and effectively reboot the sequels. But I don't even think that that's what Disney was really having in mind. I think what they're doing is they're using the Mando-Verse to tell what happens after Return of the Jedi, begin to lay the groundwork for the sequels, and eventually connect the threads. At least that's what they've been saying.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's more advantageous to set it up. Because like I said, when you're trying to connect things that wasn't originally designed to be connected, it gets messy. It gets even more convoluted and screwed up. And I think what you would do I think what we should end up happening is that you'll end up sullying everything that's been good about the Mando-Verse thus far. And I think that would be an egregious act, honestly. But because you have to answer for so much, and there's so many things that I mean, I have an idea on how you could set it up, and and it would kind of make sense, at least so far that I've gotten. I'll come up with, but yeah, I think the sequel trilogy is here. It's here to stay. It was a gaffe, unfortunately. It's a big, huge blotch in the Star Wars armor, as we always like to say, and we just have to live with it. I mean, nothing's perfect, so the only thing in now is just like, all right, moving forward, anything after the sequel trilogy just has to be really good.
Well, there's a couple of different ways that you could do this too. So I would agree that, well, there was a franchise, and I can't remember which one it was. I wish I could. There was something where they were in a similar situation, that they made a movie or two or something, and they didn't like it. So what they did was they used clever storytelling to tell stories around it, in a sense,
Well, David's
nullifying or bypassing it.
David's favorite Fast and the Furious. I mean, they kind of did that with Han with that whole Tokyo Drift thing.
Yeah, but they
Because
explained it though.
yeah, but that's what I'm saying. But like I said, I don't know if that was originally supposed to be that way though.
Well, probably not. But I mean,
That's what I'm saying. Like they kind of found a creative way to tell that story to bring him back. So it's not like, because everyone will be like, wait, he died. How is he in, the seventh movie or something stupid like that? You know what I mean? Whereas it's like, okay, he died like, 5 movies ago. You know what I
I'll
mean?
tell you what though.
So
Here's the thing about Fast and the Furious. I only wish that David were here to actually hear this. The fact that they brought Han back to life was probably the least unrealistic thing in those films. It's kind of like they left reality behind a long time ago, that bringing Han back, you're just kind of like, well, of course,
okay.
right?
Yeah,
I mean,
whatever. Right.
I don't think you felt it as much as if they had done that on the fourth or fifth film. Because really, up
Yeah.
until Fast 5, and again, I know this isn't a Fast and Furious podcast, but up until Fast 5, they were starting to go into their more Mission Impossible-ish direction, but it was still relatively, and I stress the word relatively, it was still relatively grounded in reality. Whereas once you got past that, it was like a Mission Impossible, James Bond. It's just started to get really fantastical.
Ridiculous.
But here's the thing, though, with the Star Wars deal, there's a couple of things they could do. First, let me say, though, that I would agree that you're probably right. They should probably just accept the fact that the sequel trilogy is there. And they could, even within that, they could reboot certain things. They could reboot elements of it. They could keep the main storyline intact and just emphasize certain parts of it moving forward. And you wouldn't necessarily, I think, feel any bumpiness or any weirdness to that. The only way, though, that they're going to actually do anything significant, there's two ways they could do it. One, they could invoke the world between worlds. That would be the one clean way that they could nullify the sequel trilogy. It would be dangerous from a marketing perspective. But then again, fans universally hate it. It's almost like you can't make it worse. The second way, which would be the more natural way to do it, and again, we did a show on this, but I'm not suggesting they do this like within the next 5 years. This is something they should do like maybe 15 years from now. And that is, if you begin to reboot the whole thing. Or not the whole thing, but maybe you reboot the original trilogy. Because remember, we were talking about that. Should they reboot the original trilogy? Have Ewan McGregor now take over as Obi-Wan, and an rebooted episode 4? They could fix a lot of the holes in canon that were created and make it a little bit smoother. If they did that, they would then have grounds to be able to then reboot the sequels. And if they wanted to maybe go in a different direction, they could. But, Yeah, I agree. I think that would be dangerous, and because the problem is you have these films, so unless you actually made them out of print, like if they did with the sequel trilogy what they did with the theatrical release of the original trilogy, where they're just out of print, you couldn't get them anymore. You're you're basically pulling a Palpatine at that point, right? You're wiping it out
Mhm.
of existence. They could do that, but it would probably be smarter to just let the sequel trilogy be what it is, tell stories leading up to it, and then if you want to tell stories afterwards, which we know they're going to, they can then
Mhm.
move forward from there and do that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's honestly my take. I mean, because if we're gonna talk about, so if we're gonna go with that, what needs to happen? Like, because we got a lot of, and I kind of have some notes here, but we've got like a lot of major players and a lot of major things that are going on in regards to the Mando-Verse right now. So far, we still, we've got what, 3 seasons of Mandalorian. We've got
Yep.
one season of Boba Fett. We've got one season of Ahsoka. Um, so that's so far, our Mando-Verse, essentially. So here's what we know. We have all these major players. We got Grogu, Gideon, Ahsoka, Luke, Din, the New Republic. Han and Leia are still out there. Boba Fett's out there. Thrawn's there. Ezra, Sabine, um, Mandalore, Bo-Katan. So we have all these major players, and so when we get to the sequel trilogy, of course, we see none of these characters. So now we have to explain where they all went. And for 3 movies, no one's seen no hide nor hair of them. So now they could, once again, kind of do the whole Ahsoka thing, which um, we kind of know that, like, okay, Ezra pulled Ahsoka out of that battle with Vader in the World Between Worlds, but it's like, okay, well, where does she go? Where has she been all this time? What is she? And we still don't have those answers yet. So I
Well,
think we definitely need to figure that out.
let's take that
Moving forward.
first, because there's a
Mhm.
couple of possibilities that they can do. One of the things is you can always talk about. I mean, how many times have you seen the movie about the soldier who used to be like the superstar soldier, and then he was discharged or whatever, and he just decided to live a normal life for a long time, and then
Mhm.
his old army captain or whatever pulls him back in on some mission, that kind of thing.
All
You
right.
could do something like that, because again, you have to understand these stories actually work fine even on our single planet of Earth, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of times people
Absolutely.
forget about this. We equate a lot of these storylines that we see in movies, and we forget that a lot of that takes place on just this one single planet. Yet in Star Wars, you've got this entire galaxy. So
Mhm.
it's not inconceivable for, because we already know that at the time Ahsoka was disillusioned. Now, of course, one of the problems that they have that you might bring up is the fact that Rebels kind of changed all that when they brought her back into the action again. So,
Mhm.
that's basically not too far before episode 4. That's where it becomes a little bit of an issue. Is that
Yeah.
it's kind of like she's all of a sudden gone. But again, she really wasn't a full-blown Jedi, but the problem was she was instrumental in the rebellion. And I think the problem that you have, this, which is what you're getting at, is like, look, she's a very major player. She's a very powerful person. This is a person
Mhm.
you would want front and center in the rebellion in episode 4. Why wasn't she there, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because, and not only that, but you've already faced Vader once. Now, granted, you lost, but it's like, okay. The other part about it is like now you have two of his kids That's, basically, and like you said, we often talk about like, okay, well, who blew up the Death Star? Oh, Luke Skywalker. His name is ringing all over the place. So unless Skywalker is like the name Jones or Johnson or something
Yeah,
like
right,
that,
exactly, or
like,
Smith or
okay,
whatever.
yeah, exactly. Like you would think Ahsoka would have been like, wait, Skywalker? Hmm? She would at least inquire about that. Like, all right, I could see Leia not popping up on her radar because she had a different last name. But Luke, yeah. A guy named Luke Skywalker, who's this phenomenal pilot, blew up the Death Star that just so happens to be co-run by her former master. Yeah, coincidence? I think not.
I
What I
know.
mean?
Well, Ahsoka, she's probably of all the characters the most problematic. Because again, if they had just left it to where she was disillusioned and just disappeared, the biggest thing, again, from a business and marketing standpoint, it made sense, but from a story standpoint, Filoni big time painted himself into a corner when he brought her back for Rebels. Because now
Well,
you're putting her smack in the middle of the rebellion. Forget the whole Jedi thing.
well, that's the thing because it's like, okay, when we see Ahsoka, this is post Return of the Jedi. So my thing is, it's like, okay, let's just say you've been looking. Okay, Ezra gets, you know, trapped in the ship with Thrawn, and he gets, transported to the unknown regions, essentially. So Ahsoka wants to go find him. Okay,
Well, all right,
I get,
I
but my thing
guess.
is, but I get that. But my thing is like, okay, you're looking for Ezra when the whole entire galaxy is being
Exactly.
overrun by this
Right.
empire. It
It's
doesn't
like,
make sense. It's
kind of
like,
a.
yeah, you're looking for one kid, and it's like, okay, you're just
It's
gonna
like, look,
bypass this
right. I
whole
know
thing
the
that's
Empire.
blowing the
Yep.
planets and
All this stuff. Exactly. You got this Death Star thing going, but you know what? I've got to find Ezra. They're fine.
exactly. They'll be all right. They'll
They'll
figure it
be
out.
okay.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
go over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Yeah. They'll
like
be they'll
it
be
doesn't make
cool.
sense.
They got it. Everything's good. I know, and that's what I mean. It's a glaring error, and that's the problem, is that when you talk about uniting the Star Wars canon, uniting the Mando-Verse with the sequels actually is not that difficult. In fact, I think that that's the path they're on, to be honest with you. I mean, I think that they are going to follow the Marvel playbook in a sense, where you have all these individual series that make up the Mando-Verse, and then you're going to unite them in a film, a la Avengers. And
That makes sense. That would
and
I can understand.
well, and I think that that's the plan. I think that that's exactly what they're
Hmm.
doing. And the question, of course, becomes, there's the whole rumor that they're gonna revamp Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire and call it Heir to the Empire, and try to make that work with these characters. Which that would be a topic for another show on whether or not that's a good idea or not. But the
Right.
thing is that uniting that is fine because the Mandoverse and the sequels both take place on opposite ends of this 30-year gap. And I think that that's
Yeah.
something that is very easily um, attainable as far as doing it smoothly. But here's the kicker, though. You do
Mhm.
have to be careful once you start to connect those threads and you're getting closer, because if you start to make a mistake, you can't go back and undo like two steps. And you know what I mean? It's like they really have to
You
work
have to leave
hard.
enough space, and you have to leave enough space for the transition.
You
So
could do that. You could do that. You could leave, in other words, instead of actually making the transition, just like go up to a certain point and leave it to somebody else or maybe nobody.
yeah, yeah, maybe nobody, and just kind of like, all right. So here's was kind of what I was thinking, and we can kind of go from here. If so, I named all the different major characters because we have a lot of major people. We've got Grogu, Mandalore, because Bo-Katan wants to take over Mandalore. We kind of left off with that. We still got Gideon. We don't really know what if his motives are strictly unto himself, Thrawn, or Palpatine. So that's a whole nother thing. Ahsoka, we got Luke, which we've already seen in the end of season 2 when he tried to uh, bring back Grogu with him and train him as a Jedi. We still have Din. We got the New Republic is still kind of trying to basically assert itself back as the operating government. We know
Sure.
Han and Leia are still around. At this point, they're probably working on making, Kylo. Then you still got Boba Fett. We've had the Book of Boba Fett, which we've already seen one season of. Thrawn has returned. Ezra's returned. Sabine's returned. Hera, Mon Mothma. We have all these major players that we all kind of go in love, who are, of course, absent from. Well, Mon Mothma, I think she was in the sequel trilogy, wasn't she? Did she make it to the sequel trilogy? I'm trying to remember. No, I don't think so.
No,
I don't think so. I think that was
no,
just
because it
Lorna
was
Dern.
well,
Lorna Dern's character. It's basically the new
yeah.
Mon Mothma.
Well,
basically,
because
right?
remember that Mon Mothma, I mean, she may have though, because she was the New Republic person. Remember, the sequel trilogy dealt with the Resistance. We never actually saw the New Republic in the sequels.
Right. So, and here's
And
this
she
is where
might have died on Hosnian Prime for all we know.
Yeah, and this is where I'm going with it all. So, what we've seen thus far in Ahsoka is okay. We've gotten to the unknown regions. We found Thrawn, of course, and we found Ezra.
Right.
Now, Eric, you're a lot more familiar with the Thrawn series than I, but I've done some research on the Thrawn books, so you can kind of maybe fill in the gaps for me if I'm missing anything or leaving out some key points. But I think like the biggest thing that we could do in kind of setting up the first order is Thrawn comes back. We already know he has those little containers, and we're trying to figure out like, okay, well, what's in these containers? We've kind of seen they've had this whole the Dathomir witches have these like undead troopers or whatever the heck that is, right? So I'm guessing that maybe, and they've kind of hinted to in this in is it Mandalorian? Mandalorian and Ahsoka, I believe, that something bigger is out there. We also know that Palpatine always talked about he felt something dark kind of pulling from the unknown regions, and he wanted to kind of figure out what the heck that was because that was threatening his empire. What if those feelings that he was sensing were the Grisk? So what happens is like, okay, of course, Thrawn has the Chiss, and I think it's in the Thrawn Ascendancy series. The Chiss kind of asked Thrawn's help to kind of take out some outposts or something like that with the Grisk, and they kind of succeeded. But then, of course, Thrawn kind of ends up in this whole situation with Ezra and whatnot. So I'm thinking, like, what if Thrawn comes back? He's in the known universe, and he's basically trying to, in a way, not necessarily take over, but in the way he is, because he knows the Grisk are coming. And he basically is like, look, we need to be able to defeat these guys, and these guys are pretty powerful. So we kind of need all hands on deck. So what happens if we had everybody, because Mandalore is in the unknown, not the unknown regions, but it's in the outer realm. So that means you have Mandalore, you also have Tatooine, which is run by Boba Fett. And now, of course, we still have a young Luke Skywalker at the time. So, what if there's like this giant war with the New Republic, and he kind of enlists the New Republic, like, "Hey, look, I know you guys kind of want to take me out, but I'm the least of your worries. You need to be worried about these guys that's on the way." So, what if there's like some big war that takes place, and then now the remnants of that war kind of leaves everything kind of once again dismantled, and now you kind of have people from the New Republic and from Thrawn's whole little empire. They kind of come up with like the first order. They're like, okay, we need to an established government yet again. Let's just call it the first because it's a new beginning. Let's call it the first order or whatnot. And then, of course, Luke disappears because of his failure with Kylo, which leaves a void in the Force, which is why Rey has to come up, because Luke basically detached himself from the Force. So the Force is like, well, there's darkness coming, but there's nobody powerful enough on the light side to deal with it. Let's bring Rey into the fold. And that's how Rey is kind of selected. She's kind of the need and then maybe that's kind of what sets up the sequel trilogy.
Well, they did say they were going to set it up. How they said they were going to set it up remains to be seen. But the problem with a lot of that, though, is the fact that you also have the novels. See, everybody leaves out the novels when the novels are actually a big source of canon, according to Disney. And so you have to take the totality of all those, because the Aftermath trilogy sets up a lot of the First Order. Granted, this is happening right around maybe 3 years or so before Mandalorian happens, but you are basically setting up big time with the Imperial remnants. Now, you could squeeze Thrawn in there. You could, because even the book sort of left it more or less open. You know, it's kind of like, okay, all these warlords and stuff and you know, all these Grand Moffs and admirals and all this stuff are basically taking the ships and everything under their command, and they're trying to fight each other basically in order to increase the size of their fleet, so that way they can lay claim to the Empire. That's basically what a lot of these novels in the new canon I'm talking about are about. You know, it's basically about this power struggle between who's going to control it. Now, of course, if you flash forward a few years, and then we leave, of course, with Ahsoka, where Thrawn is now back in the proper universe, let's just say. Now, we don't know what's going to happen from there. We don't know. I mean, we're assuming it's in Ahsoka Season 2 that this might continue, but this could also continue in Mandalorian Season 4. We really don't know what they're going to do yet. But you could set it up to where Thrawn comes in, he claims the Empire for himself, because, I mean, number one, he'd be probably the highest ranking officer that's left. Number two, he has the power and he has the fleet and he has the strategy. He could easily do it. And this would actually lend credence to the whole idea that you have, you basically have a situation where it's starting to brush the plot of Heir to the Empire at this point. Because Heir to the Empire actually had a lot of this stuff. You know, Heir to the Empire was actually talking about this very thing, where you had Thrawn basically was pretty much seized control of the Imperial remnants, and in fact, the term Imperial remnants was an invention of Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy, Heir to the Empire, you know, Dark Force Rising, Last Command, that original Thrawn trilogy. So what you had is Filoni was able to more or less mirror this in the Mando-Verse, and so it does lend rumors to the fact that, okay, this is what he's trying to do. He's trying to recreate Heir to the Empire, but with the Mando-Verse. And you could probably do that. I don't know, because obviously now that they brought Palpatine back for Rise of Skywalker, and we find out that, oh, this whole thing was a Palpatine plan now. It was part of his master plan. See, in the Thrawn trilogy, Palpatine was truly dead. There was an Emperor clone. That's true. And that Emperor clone briefly got Luke to turn to the dark side and all that, and then, you know, he eventually destroyed him again. But that was just a clone. This is a little bit different. This is basically Palpatine going, yeah, guess what? Now the First Order was leading to the Final Order, and I created Snoke, and, you know, I basically had this master plan all the way from the beginning, and, you know, you had, what was that, that one general guy's name in Rise of Skywalker? Oh, it's like on the tip of my tongue, too. The guy that was actually in league with Palpatine.
Oh, so not Hux, the one who is that the one who shot Hux?
Yeah. I can't remember his name. Yeah, I'm sure somebody will chat it in. Speaking of chats, Dragonfly says a lot of the characters could die in the crossover movie. I predict Thrawn and Ezra killing each other. He goes on to say the new Thrawn has become a bit more of a personal villain for Ezra than Luke. And that's true. That is actually a significant way in which they have deviated from the Thrawn of the original books that Timothy Zahn wrote, and this Thrawn that we're getting now in live action is that he's a little bit more of a foil for Ezra at this point. Which makes sense
General
because
Pride,
obviously the
by the
Ezra...
way.
Well, huh?
General Pride, by the way.
Pride. Yeah, how can I forget that?
Pride.
Yeah, General Pride. And that's the point. You had people like Pride. You had all these people who were actually in league with the Emperor the whole time. At least that's what they're implying. And then you have now Ezra, who is sort of taking over for Luke as Thrawn's main nemesis at this point.
Yeah.
So you do have to remember that they have to revamp a little of this stuff now because you don't have what you had before in the expanded universe. You have this whole new, as you brought up, cast of characters, right? So, I mean, it comes down to the connective tissue because you have to know what you're setting up in order to begin setting it up. And by that, I mean, you have to know the destination before you set out on your journey, right? It's like, okay, if we're going to
reverse engineer, basically.
Yeah. I mean, look, if they're going to connect, and again, right now, we're only talking about the Mando-Verse and the sequel trilogy, which is really what Ted's whole thing was, right? I mean, that was the comment, basically. But when you're just connecting those two, which I suppose is probably the most important time periods that we're talking about post-Return of the Jedi, right? So, because one's happening in the beginning, one's happening at the end of that 30-year period. So here's what you have to do. You have to say, okay, this is where we're ending up. How are we going to get there? Like, what's the overall story arc of, you know, this happens, and then the sequel trilogy happens, and then you can begin filling in all the details. My fear is that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is they're going to do very much like what they did with the sequel trilogy. It becomes that choose your own adventure where they're just going to come up with, you know, cool stories that are fine for the moment, but they're going to end up either painting themselves into a corner or it's just going to be lackluster. Or it's not going to make sense. See, that's what I'm afraid of.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely. I mean, those are legitimate concerns, definitely, and that's one of those things where I said, like, you can't. I don't think they should get too close to the sequel trilogy. I think they should stop it. You know, maybe 10, 15 years, maybe prior to the events of the sequel trilogies. That way, you leave enough space for a suitable transition to actually happen. So now when you actually see the First Order, it's like, okay, well, that's what happened in that 10 to 15 year period. That's when the First Order truly flushed itself out. Snoke kind of took over, or maybe you see the beginnings of Snoke at the tail end of the Mando-Verse.
Well, we saw the beginnings of Snoke even in the comics. There was the Kylo Ren series. And that's
that's what I'm saying in the comics. But I'm just talking about visually speaking, like on the screen, like no one's.
But what I'm saying though is you can't ignore see, the thing is, this is the beauty of them canonizing everything is great, because what that means is that you're not compartmentalizing the storylines. The danger though is you now have this whole extra medium that you can't contradict, right? Because if you have the comics now, and you start talking about, say, how, you know, Snoke and Kylo meet or whatever, you have to more or less if you want to show that, you have to duplicate it.
Duplicate it, yeah.
Or if you don't duplicate it, maybe you just, you know, pick up where you left off, right? You can't
Well, I'm just saying, like, show where
contradict
Snoke
it.
came from. Like, basically, because basically, when we open up with the Rise of Skywalker, I mean, not the Rise of Skywalker, the Force Awakens. When we open up with the Force Awakens, Snoke is already in control of the First Order. All
Right.
I'm saying is like we just need to see where he came from in the sense of like,
Well,
oh,
I thought
okay,
that's where you were going, because if you think about it, we kind of did. In The Rise of Skywalker, we saw a bunch of little Snokes in like tubes. And
well,
Palpatine was
yeah,
like,
but
I
I'm just saying,
created
like,
Snoke. I mean,
what I'm saying is like, okay, but how did he become leader of the First Order? That's what I'm saying. Like, we knew that he created him, but we're saying like, okay, there had to be a change of power, is what I'm saying, because at one point, like right now, the New Republic is the governing body, essentially. In the Mando-Verse, the New Republic is what's
in the galaxy,
running
but
everything.
not in the where the change of power would have to come from is in the Empire itself. How does it go from the Imperial remnants, and more importantly, which is I think where you're going with this, Thrawn, right? I mean, it's implied that Thrawn
Hmm.
now is, at least he's about to. It happened in the
Yeah.
expanded universe where he was the guy, and it seems like that's what they're setting up in the Mando-Verse, that Thrawn is going to be the guy. So how does it transition from Thrawn to Snoke? I think that's what you would probably have to show.
Well, yeah, because see, the only reason why I'm saying that is because you have the New Republic right now. They're the operating government. You have Thrawn coming in with his version of the Empire.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you just have two different. It's no different than the prequels where you had the Separatists versus the Republic, essentially. What I'm saying is, by the time we get to the Force Awakens, it's clearly that the First Order is the ruling government, because then now you wouldn't have a resistance, because the resistance is essentially the rebellion.
No, that's where it's a little bit convoluted, and this is why I criticize the sequel trilogy for not doing a good enough job. That's not actually the case. That's what a lot of people think until you really start to dig into it. And they actually mention it in The Force Awakens, but again, they didn't really mention it strong enough, and so it blows by people. So everybody thinks the Resistance is a new rebellion. They're not. The New Republic is actually very much in control and very much alive and well in The Force Awakens. What happened was Leia and a bunch of other people were basically disagreeing with the New Republic leadership, saying, we need to be doing more to counteract the First Order. The First Order is gaining power, and we need to do more to stop that. The New Republic is like, what's the problem? We've got control of the entire galaxy. The First Order is nothing. They're insignificant. This is why Starkiller Base was such a big deal. See, if they had actually done a little bit better job of storytelling, they could have set this up. The reality was we never even saw the New Republic in The Force Awakens.
Except when they were getting obliterated by Starkiller Base.
Exactly. Yeah. So it made it look like, and that's what made it so bad, was the Resistance was a pretty much a group that was made up of a bunch of former rebels that were disagreeing with because Leia was basically kind of like the second in command, but she was splitting off, and so she secretly formed the Resistance in order to counteract, because they wouldn't order the New Republic military to do anything about the First Order. And so that's what was going on. The Resistance was not actually, the New Republic was very much in control of everything. And that's why Starkiller Base was created from under their nose, and they had no idea, because they didn't really consider it a big deal. And that's when the First Order was like, okay, the New Republic's going to fall, and on it goes. And yeah, then they obliterate Hazian Prime and, 6 other planets. And and then the Resistance is all that left. And then all that's really left of the New Republic at that point is like what's on board the Millennium Falcon.
Well, then that also kind of makes, in that I see the tie-in that they tried to do in Ahsoka in a way, because given that insightful nugget you just dropped, that makes sense when we see that whole scene where Hera is when she's with Mon Mothma and she's in court basically, And she's like, and that one senator kind of has it out for her.
Mm-hmm.
Now that makes sense why it's like, okay, well, that keeps going up the chain. So now you kind of see why the resistance had to be formed,
Yeah, and
because
what they're doing, they're mirroring a character, Philia. Oh, what was his name? He appeared in a lot of expanded universe novels. He was like Leia's main nemesis in the Senate. And he was always like the guy that was, against her and stuff like that, because he had a little bit too much faith in the politics and the government and all that stuff, and he was never able to see the danger. He's kind of like in CTU and 24, right? All the higher ups that thought Jack was crazy. It's very much the same kind of thing, the whole bureaucratic thing. And so basically that senator that you're talking about was almost like kind of a stand-in, and they basically tried to create that tonality, but the problem is they never showed any of that stuff. It's like you wouldn't. I mean, they had lines in The Force Awakens that inferred it, that if you were paying attention, you picked up on it, but it was very subtle, and you didn't really feel bad, because the only time you ever saw Hosnian Prime was just when everybody's like looking up at the pretty lights, basically. You weren't really invested. You're just like, well, I don't care about any of these people.
Right.
It wasn't even real. Like, they didn't do a really good job. Like, here's a good example of a master storyteller like George Lucas. We didn't even know what Alderaan was. We never saw the planet. Like, all you saw was the planet. But yet, the way that he wrote, like, Leia's reaction, just all that stuff, and it just, you felt the tension, you felt the sorrow, you felt everything, right?
Well, and everything was kind of leading up. I mean, you kind of almost had everything filtering, because that's where Obi-Wan, Han, Luke, Chewie, that's where they were all going.
Right.
They were on their way to Alderaan, and then Leia's from Alderaan, and she's like,
and then of course Obi-Wan had the reaction he did,
and of
suddenly
course,
had whatever would line.
Yeah, disturbance is like a thousand voices cried out, and then
someone cried and they were silenced. Yeah.
But then there's also makes sense that whole line when Tarkin, when he's in the boardroom, and he was like, the last remnants of the, because they kept talking about it, like, okay, when they were on board Channel 4, Channel 5, and they were like, okay, well, the Imperial Senate finds out about this, and then of course in the boardroom, they're still talking about the Imperial Senate, like, hey, the Emperor just, basically dissolved the Senate, and the last remnants of it has been swept away. So then now when Leia's, talking about, oh, Alderaan doesn't have any, so it all kind of comes together in a way where you kind of think like, well, maybe that's what the Imperial Senate is on Alderaan or something like that. So at least, yeah, you do have.
I mean, it wasn't, but I could see where somebody would get that. The Imperial Senate was on course. I mean, the Imperial Senate was the Republic Senate. That's why I love what they did in Andor, when they kept showing, like, as time went on, more of the Senate pods were empty. It was like you saw that it was just more of a ceremonial thing, like there was no real power there. I mean, that's what was so funny when Mothma's daughter was just like, well, guys don't have any real power. It's because it was true. It was like the Emperor was brilliant enough to go, you know what? Let them keep up the facade and think that they're doing whatever they're doing. And by the time they realize it, it'll be too late. And that was the moment in episode 4 when it's like, okay, now's the time. And it's like, you know what? You don't have to worry about the Imperial Senate. They've been dissolved. Because now that he had the Death Star, and that was the key. Now that he had the Death Star, now all bets are off. We don't have to keep up with pretenses anymore. It's like, you know what? Yeah, you guys are gone. I'm the Emperor now. I'm in charge. So there you go. And the same thing was more or less starting to happen, but they just got a little bit too complacent. Now the New Republic was almost becoming kind of like the prequel era Republic, in a sense. And so that's what one of the things that Leia was trying to do, just trying to warn against, like, you guys don't understand what's really going on. And so they were trying to stop the First Order, and of course that didn't work. And that's what gave The Last Jedi a slight Battlestar Galactica feel. I mean, not only did you have this like slow ship chase going on, but at the same time, you also had what was essentially all that was left of at least the government. I mean, there was still a lot of New Republic planets. It's not like, not like Starkiller Base wiped the entire New Republic out, but it took out the capital. It would have been like blowing up Coruscant.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything was in a disarray. And see, I would have wanted to see more of that. That was the other problem that I had with the sequel trilogy. It's like, do you guys realize how much story was in that?
Yeah.
You're giving us Canto Bight chase scenes and all this. No, this is really the more compelling story. You have a fascist organization where they did a brilliant job. I mean, it was probably the best part when Hux was giving his little Hitler speech. And you had the whole First Order and all that stuff. It's like, okay, you got this like fascist government that everybody is they're underestimating them. This whole little like regime that are ready to strike at this point. And then you have a soft New Republic that just doesn't expect it, doesn't think about it, doesn't see it as a threat. Now their capital planet is destroyed. Now all this other stuff is destroyed. Well, I want to see that. I want to see the aftermath of that.
Yeah.
It's like not
kid,
not. I mean, it's
no. That's a very valid point, though. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the kind of stuff. They're leaving this stuff on the table, and it's like, what are you guys doing? This is why I think people had an issue with the storytelling. It's not because they made Luke into a grumpy old man or something. It's like, no, that was the least of their problems. In fact, I gave them a little bit of points for that because they gave us something in Luke's character that is very realistic considering the trajectory of where he was on and what was going on at the time. And they
also had to have something that was going to challenge Luke because it's like at that point, he's a grandma. So it's like, okay, we know physically, or I won't say physically, but there's not too many people who will be able to really stand up against him power-wise. But when you have to fight within yourself, that's the greatest enemy that you have. It's like, when you beat yourself up over things.
But here's the thing, though, and this is where I almost agree with people on this. I think the problem that people had is the fact that we grew up with Luke from the time that he was just a farm boy learning about the Force. This would have been the time that we could have actually seen that all play out. That could have been the reward. Let's see Grandmaster Jedi Luke Skywalker. Let's see him ignite that green and just wreck shop. Yeah. And instead, we didn't get it. I mean, we got that more in the season 2 finale of The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
And that's more or less what we wanted to see. It wasn't that people didn't understand.
I think that's why that was put. I think that's why they put it in there because it's like, okay,
100%.
That's they wanted to, because it was like, okay, well, now the fans are kind of coming back, like, all right, thank you, give us something,
give us something, and that was the problem. Is the fact that it's because we were on this journey with him that we wanted to see the culmination of everything that he had learned and to finally achieve this, and just give us like one film. Like, he could have been disillusioned later, or what they could have done was they could have kept him alive, let him be disillusioned in The Last Jedi, but in The Rise of Skywalker, which would have made the title make a lot more sense, then he could have come up. I mean, honestly, when they first announced the title, that's what I thought they were talking about. I got all excited. I'm like, Rise of Ski, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. But it turned out it wasn't the rise of Luke Skywalker. It was the rise of Rey Skywalker. It's like, great, yet another thing this chick's not earning. It's like, you didn't earn the Skywalker name. Exactly. You haven't even lost a limb yet. I mean, what's going on?
At least a finger.
Yeah, like a finger or something. It's like, I mean, you know,
Right.
Dom
It's like
agrees.
the initiation.
Dom says we got scammed.
That's right.
You know,
To
he,
Dom, you listen.
he thought the same. You know, and that's basically what it comes down to, and that's what they have to do in doing all this stuff. Is like I said, I mean, with the sequel trilogy, they missed the big opportunity of actually giving us more than what they actually gave us because it was there.
Mhm.
See, a lot of people, when they criticize the sequel trilogy, they don't realize the story was actually there. And it wasn't like, oh, they could have told something better. They could have done, you know, whatever. It's like, no, no, no. It was there. They just chose not to focus on the obvious. And instead, they gave us what they thought. They were trying to make a $1 billion movie. They were trying to replicate what Lucas did. They wanted to get that. It's no different than like YouTubers that go, okay, I'm going to make a viral video. It's like you don't make a viral video. You make good videos, and then by the luck of the draw, they happen to go viral, you know? You don't make a, I mean, I guess you can sort of, like, there's a formula for writing a hit song, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee it's going to be a hit, though.
True.
And then there's usually some
Prince did say that he know, but then Prince is like a genius, so you kind of have to kind of go with that.
Well, even that, there's a lot of songs that even he wrote that weren't hits, even though he followed the formula. There's a lot of people, like when people would try to write a hit song, a lot of times it wouldn't hit, but no pun intended. But basically, what would happen is like some weird song or whatever that, you know,
because I got high.
Well,
Afro Man, because I got high. It's all of this cult classic all of a sudden.
well, but I mean, the thing that I wish I can think of the example. There was one example where the artist had their album complete, and then they just decided, you know what, we need an extra song to fill up whatever, so let's just put it on. And that's the song that became the hit. You know, there's a lot of cases, too, where certain hit songs, the artist wanted to actually leave that off the album, but the record company convinced them to keep it on the album. You know, you can't fabricate this stuff. And the problem that Lucasfilm has is that they're trying to make that cultural phenomenon. It's like, no.
Yeah.
Just tell a good story. Just tell good stories.
Let it stand on its own. Yeah.
Let it stand on its own. And it's not that hard. Well, I mean, obviously it is. But if they would just get out of their own way, they could do it. So I think that what you have to do in order to unite, I mean, let's just do this with our concluding thoughts here. Let's just try to give a final statement, each of us, on here's how we're going to unite the Mando-Verse and the sequel trilogy, and then follow that up with uniting the entire canon. And yes, my silence means you're going first.
Yes, I kind of gathered that.
You know, it's like,
yeah, all right.
For the record, I could go, but I'm trying to be cool, and I'm trying to default. I'm trying to be a good guy and
this
let
is
you
like
go.
that. It's like the coin toss at the beginning of a football game. It's like, yeah, you want the ball after halftime. I get it, but
hey, man.
I would just say, like, you know, I still stand on what I said earlier. I mean, maybe you don't use all the exact things, but I think that the biggest thing is to try to set up the sequel trilogy. I think it's better to kind of really, like you just said, like maybe flush out a little bit more of the political landscape. So then that way we understand what's going on. Because that was a very key point that, like, I didn't, you know, up until you said something, I had no idea. I much like a lot of people, I thought that the resistance was basically the new rebellion. And, you know, it's like, and the first order became the new government. But unbeknownst to me, you know, it's kind of like it's like a little subgroup or a little, you know, club or whatever. And they just decided, like, okay, you know, we're going to eventually take over. It's like almost like a weird militia in a way.
Kind of like the Separatists. You could almost think of them like the Separatists versus the Republic.
Well, and that's what I was thinking initially. Like, they're kind of like, because that's what I thought the New Republic
You thought it
and the
was the other
First
way
Order.
around. You thought the resistance was more like the separatists, and the First Order was more like the government in charge.
Well, yeah, in the sequel trilogy,
Right.
yes,
That's what I
yeah,
mean. Yeah.
yeah. But I'm just saying, like leading up to it, I always thought that it would have been because the New Republic was growing, and I thought the First Order kind of eventually took over the New Republic,
Hmm.
much like the Empire kind of absorbed what the Empire turned into. The Republic turned into the Empire.
Right.
But in this case, I felt like, they kind of like, well, in my scenario, there's a big war. So like we need a government. So I think they just kind of just cobbled together whatever they could and came up with the First Order. And then out of that, that's kind of what took over. And Leia was like, I see too many problems with this. This is not done right. And we're going to need a group to stop them because I see where this is going. That's kind of where I was kind of taking it. As far as unifying um, the whole canon, that's a toughie. I mean, most of it is cool. I just think that you have a lot of one of the biggest issues, of course, is Ahsoka, as we aforementioned, because you really have to explain how this Jedi who's super powerful, who was trained by like Anakin, Obi-Wan, Yoda, Mace, like she's
Yeah.
really, like she's
She
really
is by
powerful.
far the problematic character in
The
this.
problematic character in all of this. And when you bring her back, it's like, okay, well, you brought her back in Rebels, and it's like, all right,
That was
cool.
the
But
problem.
then now, yeah, exactly. That's therein lies the problem, because then now she disappears again throughout the whole entire original trilogy, which is crucial to the galaxy. And then now you have her popping up again after the fact. So it's kind of like, all right. And
I
there's
mean,
some
the
key things like that, like I said before, you have Luke Skywalker who blew up the Death Star. So by after that, by Empire, everybody's like chanting this guy's name. And, you know, you would think that was like, okay, well, like I said, unless Skywalker is a name like Smith or
well,
Johnson or something
but
like
there is
that.
another. There's a couple of things though that could be very plausible in that issue. One, you have to remember that a lot of that news and stuff travels within the core worlds, but not necessarily like the Outer Rim, not all the other stuff, right? So if she's hanging out somewhere out there, she might never have even heard any of this stuff. And that's an extremely plausible thing. In fact, not to shoehorn myself into your little wrap up part here, but I mean, if I were gonna go for the Ahsoka explanation, that's what I would do. There's one or two things they could do. That would be the most plausible. The other thing they could do, it would be cheap storytelling, but they could do it, is she almost pulls a Luke, right? After that whole thing with Vader, she gets shaken up and just like loses it and just goes off into exile for how many ever years. And then when she comes back, it's kind of like, oh, look, the galaxy's a little different than what I left.
Yeah. I just think that that's going to be like all in all. Therein lies a big problem character. So
Oh
if they
yeah.
can find a way to really explain that's that's legitimate in canon, um, I don't know. I think everything else kind of could kind of work itself out. I think the original trilogy can still stand on its own and it's fine. Um, And I just feel like, okay, now you just have to decide what are you going to do either directly after or we're going to pick up from the Mando-Verse and, push it on through. And like I said, I still stand by the whole in maybe 10 to 15 years before the sequel trilogy. So to give yourself that space to transition to the sequel trilogy, whether you want to fill that with something or you just kind of want to make a opening crawl like 15 years ago, the galaxy changed into whatever, put that in an opening crawl somewhere, and then
Hey,
now you got
maybe they'll put it in the new Fortnite game.
Right. It's new
Because
Call of Duty.
yeah, right.
but but uh but then yeah, then I think you just go for it from there.
All right. Well, I mean, and that's certainly one way to look at it, and that makes a lot of sense. And really, my thoughts on it aren't really a whole lot different, honestly. I mean, because again, I don't necessarily think the what is the problem. I think it's the how. As far
Mhm.
as what to do, yes, you could cheese out and do the world between worlds thing. I mentioned that at the beginning of the show. It's like, well, whatever, you know. But assuming they don't do that, I think the best way to unite them is, and again, you have to frame up the stories. You have to really plan this. You have to say, look, there's a sequel trilogy. There's what we're doing with the Mando-Verse. First, plan an end game for the Mando-Verse. That's first and foremost. Are you
Mhm.
going to have all these standalone series, then do a movie, then you'll have the next, like a phase 2, kind of like what they do in Marvel? Okay. And then that ends up into a movie. Like, how long is the Mando-Verse going to last? How many seasons is Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka? How long are they going to go? How many movies do we actually want to have? That's the first thing. They have to frame that part up because the sequel trilogy is already done. It's there. It's set in stone.
Mhm.
Okay? So
Yep.
the end game, as far as where the story has to go, it has to start with The Force Awakens. That's pretty much defined. So the first step is get the Mandoverse straightened out and figure out. They don't have to plan it, I guess, with absolute detail, but at least have it framed out. Here's how many seasons we want to go with each of these shows. Here's how many movies we want to do. Here's the rough outline or plot of the movies that we want to do, and start there. Then, and only then, oh, and by the way, consult the authors that are writing books that are taking place during all this stuff too. And then, that's when you can start to frame up the connective tissue. This is when you can begin maybe starting to try to tell the stories of, okay, this is what happens next and next and next, and boom, we're at The Force Awakens. But much like what
Mhm.
you're saying, I would agree. I don't necessarily think it's really vital, at least right away, that they go right up to The Force Awakens.
Yeah.
Like for instance, there's 10 years. Well, actually, that's so true. There's 19. There's 19 years between episode 3 and 4. Okay, but there's maybe roughly 10 years between Obi-Wan and episode 4.
Mhm.
So they can maybe go up to say that point. Maybe you stop at like 5 to 10 years before The Force Awakens to give you a little bit of wiggle room. Maybe you cover that with the comics and novels or something, because that's the other thing that I would do. I would say, look, what do we want to cover in film or series, whether it's animated or live action, versus what do we want to cover in novels and comics?
Yeah, because if you really think about it, like when we look at the prequels, like so they dropped Clone Wars, which is basically the beginning, the Clone Wars movie, animated movie. They dropped that as the um it's not the beginning of the Clone Wars, but the Clone Wars had already kind of started.
Well, because the Clone Wars actually begins with episode 2, Attack of the Clones, right?
Right.
And so
That's what I'm
yeah,
saying. Yeah.
yeah,
So
it's a
right
good
after
point because we don't know how long. Actually, that's a good question. Do we know how long after episode 2, the Clone Wars season 1 takes place? Because you're right. I mean, it's
no.
in there. I mean, it's
Well, see, that's what I'm saying. Like, see, at least the Clone Wars animation was designed to fill in the gaps because it's called the Clone Wars. It's designed to fill in the gaps, and it eventually overlaps certain events from Revenge of the Sith, obviously that we see. So that was by design. But Ahsoka and Mandalorian and all that stuff, like that's not tied to the sequel trilogy. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I think to your point, Eric, I think if you want to do something, that would be a perfect time to put another animated show in between the end of the Mando-Verse and the beginning of the sequel trilogy.
Yeah, you could do
So
that.
that way you have that connective. That's where you can build the connective tissue and world build. Because quite frankly, the Clone Wars series, man, did a gang of world building for us, and it brought in a lot
Mhm.
of different things, and
Mhm.
it really tied everything up. And so
Well,
that
don't
was a
forget
perfect
Clone Wars
package.
season
Yeah,
7 actually
yeah.
overlapped episode
That's
3.
what I that's what I'm saying. Like it actually overlaps some parts of episode 3, and that's what I'm saying. Like
Mhm.
that's what made it a perfect package. So like now you really fleshed everything out. Where the Mandoverse is really not designed for that. I don't
No,
think
but
and like
well, yes and no. So, you could you could go one of two ways. And this brings up another point I was going to make actually, and that is not everything has to be this linear path to go to this next thing, right? You could tell
Mhm,
adventure stories within each time period. They're doing that now with the comics. In fact, right now they're telling stories in between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and that was like a year, and they've been doing that for a while.
mhm,
And they're using a lot of the main characters too. They're talking about what happened to Han Solo's frozen, body in carbonite or whatever,
mhm.
and how it was changing hands between the Hutts and Crimson Dawn, and Vader's after it and all that stuff. The point is, even if you wanted to use the main characters and say, well, I don't really want to tell stories that aren't, focused on the main characters because we want those marketing dollars. Okay,
Well,
fine.
mhm. Well, what I'm saying is that the reason why I'm saying all this is because none of these characters make it into the sequel trilogy. So you have to get rid of them somehow. Like, and you got a gang of them. So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, that's
Well,
what I'm
and
saying. Like, if you actually, that's what I'm saying. The Mandoverse, I don't think it's designed to necessarily connect per se to the sequel trilogy. I think it's more of the setup for the sequel trilogy
no, you're
because
right. You're right. It
it puts
is.
things in motion.
But
You
here's the
use
other
the
thing too.
animated show to connect it.
Well, just as an example, originally the Rogue One characters are supposed to survive, but oddly enough, I think it might have been Kathleen Kennedy. Oddly enough, who
Hmm,
actually said, "Well, wait a second, though. Like, none of these guys are in Episode 4, so it would actually make
exactly.
more sense if they all died." And they were really surprised that they went for it because initially, I don't remember if it was Tony Gilroy or Gareth Edwards because they both were attached
Right.
to the thing.
And
Well, one of
every
them, I
director
remember
pulled out of it.
yeah, right. One of them in an interview actually said like, the death thing was on the table, but we didn't think they were going to go for it because that's kind of grim. I mean, like every main character dies. That's not a
Hmm.
usual way to end a movie. But you can get away with it in something like this because well, none of these guys are around. And to be honest, because Rogue One takes place like, it runs right into Episode 4, it just wouldn't make sense if any of those guys survived that they wouldn't be front and center on the mission, right? So
Hmm.
that part's cool. Now you could do that because Dragonfly had actually brought up earlier in the show in one of his chats, like, hey, um, you know, you could a lot of these guys might die in the crossover film.
Yeah, and
But
that's where I was getting at with that big war, because then that would explain a lot. It would explain, like, okay, if they have this giant war, you can explain why you don't see Gideon, none of the Mandalorians, Bo-Katan.
right, right.
Then you don't see Boba Fett anymore. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Well, I'm gonna say, you know what I'm saying? Like, you don't see Thrawn, Ezra Sabine. Like, if you have just one big galactic, um, standoff or whatever, and it's like, okay, basically the galaxy is resetting itself,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
essentially that's what's happening. The galaxy is like almost like right sizing itself, and it's like kind of starting over. And now you have like, okay, you just have Luke that's around, Leia, Han, um, and because then you have to figure out what happened to Grogu. Did Grogu die in that temple that he was in there with? Was he in there with Kylo training, or did he die beforehand? Because now we know he can live. His species can live like to like 900 years old at least. The heck is he? You know what I mean? So it's just like you really have a lot of characters you have to clean up, and it's like, well, you have to explain where they went.
Well, and they could explain that if the whole Mandalore thing is happening simultaneously, you know. I mean, it's conceivable that if there's enough going on Mandalore, that you wouldn't necessarily leave Mandalore to go fight in this thing. But again, one of the problems that Star Wars has always had in dealing with the macro is that it's really hard to then deal with the micro. It's hard to focus on some, outlaw in Tatooine is threatening a town and, somebody else is, when you kind of know, well, this guy was so tough, shouldn't he be up there dealing with the bigger problem? It's almost the same thing with the superhero movies. And this has been true even in the comic days, before there were ever other films. It's like New York should be the safest city in the world.
Because
I mean, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing that's funny. Now, this is illustrated in the movies, but this is happening in the comics.
They never.
You would have some crazy force is threatening all of Earth, and yet only Iron Man is there to face them. And you're like, okay, this is great, but where is everybody? Like,
yeah,
New
the
York
X-Men,
is
Superman.
Right.
You got
Spider-Man.
Batman,
yeah,
Spider-Man.
I mean, even if you stuck with either DC or Marvel, there's still just a litany of superheroes that are there. Why is only the superhero that's being featured in this one comic the only one? See, realistically, that wouldn't happen.
Exactly.
And that's the problem that Star Wars a lot of times has, too, is the fact that it's really hard for them to focus on these little microcosm type stories where it's just in one Earth, because it's like, if there's a guy that's really that powerful, it's like, well, shouldn't he be up there dealing with, the bigger threats or whatever? And that's where I think that in some ways you almost have to put that part away and allow it to focus on the stories, because the reality is, you could say that here, you might have some like really crazy cool military guy is helping clean up a town. Well, shouldn't he be fighting in, overseas or something? I mean, you could say the same thing even here on Earth in reality.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that you have to allow that for Star Wars, just because we always want to see what we would call the greater storyline. You have to allow for the fact, well, realistically, other stuff is happening here too. And that's something, by the way, that I think Andor did a really good job on, is that they focused on a lot of these, little things. Dragonfly basically says, if Resistance, Star Wars Resistance, had gotten a season 3, I read it was supposed to have some overlap with the movies. And it sort of did, actually. Now, I think it might have had even more overlap, but don't forget that it was either the end of season 1 or the beginning of season 2. I think it was the end of season 1 where they were actually watching Hux's speech on, television, essentially.
Yeah.
So it did overlap with The Force Awakens, and they were starting to do that sort of thing. And so I think it's really important that you allow Star Wars to go into these different directions. When we were talking about genre films, making for Halloween, we said, well, what if Star Wars made a horror film? Well, it's not going to deal with the bigger storyline. So, in a sense, they could do that, right? They could actually say, okay, we'll set up, like what you were suggesting. We'll use the Mando-Verse to more or less set up what happens in the sequels. But rather than try to connect it in a linear fashion, let's just tell really cool stories that are happening against the backdrop of either the Mando-Verse or the setup of the sequels. Rather than, set in stone, well, this is what's happening, right? We're not going to show you how Hux came to power, but maybe Hux coming to power is the backdrop of some other story.
Right.
That kind of thing. And honestly, I think that that's what you could do with the entire Star Wars canon. You know, you could just really pay attention to all the different things that you have going on in the comics, in the novels, animated shows, live action shows, the films. And if you just create an outline, doesn't have to be detailed, just something, then I think that you can really fix this thing. And I think you can logically connect all this stuff together. All right, so again, it doesn't really matter what we say. I mean, it kind of does because we're the ones hosting the show, but ultimately it's about you guys. So let us know in the comment section, what would you do to connect the Mando-Verse and the sequel trilogy in a meaningful and good way? That's kind of the homework assignment. And again, Monday, not really sure what we're going to talk about. There is some stuff going on in Star Wars now. There's been some news that's been released. There's been rumors that Pedro Pascal might not be in Mandalorian Season 4. You know, there's other things that are floating around, so more than likely a pre-record on Monday, but we will have a show for you on Monday. And then Wednesday, don't forget, it's our Thanksgiving special. We're going to break down our favorite scenes. We each picked a comedy scene, an action scene, and a drama scene from Star Wars. The rule was it could be from anything. It could be from the animated shows, the movies, whatever. Everything was fair game. So it's going to be me, Daryl, and our friend who always joins us on the night before Thanksgiving, Dave Cossey. He's going to be here. We're going to break down our scenes. It's going to be a really cool, just informal, hanging out. You guys aren't going to want to miss that. And of course, if you want to go back to some of our other specials, I might even link this in the description. We did a really, really funny review where we actually watched the holiday special together and reacted to it and talked about it, and it was pretty good. So I'll put a link to that in the description in case you guys have missed it, because again, we got a lot of new subscribers. We want to welcome all you guys, and if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed, consider hitting that subscribe button, and definitely hit the like button if you like the video, because it does help the channel, and we're looking to grow our community so we can bring you guys more Star Wars. All right? So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Anything else you want to say?
Nope, that's it, my friend.
For the good of the order? For the good of the First Order?
For the Empire.
Or the Empire. All right. Well, we'll see you guys Monday. Again, we'll premiere it. We'll probably be available to chat live with you guys, even if it's pre-record. So, with that, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.